On a cold Thursday morning in Mercer County, Iowa, the boardroom at Halbrecht Development barely paused when the old farmer placed a folded cashier's check on the polished walnut table. $12,000. Not even enough to cover the executive's coffee service for the week. Someone laughed softly. Someone else pushed the check back across the table with 2 fingers. Elias Turner didn't argue. He only glanced once at the county survey map hanging behind them, Section 14, Blackwater Corridor, Parcel 7, then folded the check back into his coat pocket beside a faded yellow receipt dated 1981. The company lawyers assumed he was desperate. What they didn't know was that 3 months earlier, Elias had already found something buried inside an abandoned courthouse filing cabinet that none of them had seen in 42 years. And by the time they realized what he possessed, their $48 million land deal had already stopped moving. Elias Turner driving his rusted Ford pickup through frozen gravel roads before sunrise. The heater barely works. A dented green thermos rolls against the passenger seat beside a leather notebook thick with folded papers. The narration quietly establishes his life: widowed, 68 years old, former survey assistant for the county in the late 70s, now surviving on soybean leases and repair work. He arrives at Halbrecht Development's temporary acquisition office, a converted bank downtown. The company is assembling farmland parcels for a massive interstate logistics center backed by state infrastructure money. Nearly every family in the county has already sold. Except Elias. Inside the office, everything feels sterile and expensive. Glass walls. Quiet shoes on polished floors. Young associates carrying tablets. A receptionist asks if he has an appointment without looking up. He calmly removes a handwritten letter from his coat pocket. I was told Mr. Kessler would see me at 9. The receptionist is mildly irritated but sends him upstairs. During the meeting, Senior Acquisition Director Nathan Kessler treats Elias like a stubborn relic slowing inevitable progress. Kessler explains the company's final offer for the Turner acreage. He uses rehearsed language: economic revitalization, regional growth, employment expansion. Elias listens without interruption. Then he quietly places the cashier's check on the table. $12,000. The executives stare. Kessler asks if this is supposed to be a joke. Elias replies evenly. No. It's what your access rights were originally purchased for. Confusion enters the room. A younger attorney flips through documents and says the company owns full development access through multiple easement consolidations acquired over decades. Elias simply nods and says, "That depends which survey they used." The room becomes briefly still. Kessler dismisses the statement immediately. He assumes Elias is confused about mineral access or fence line rights. He pushes the check back. We're discussing $48 million in development financing, Mr. Turner. Elias folds the check carefully and stands. So am I. Then he leaves. The scene shifts to the local diner outside town where Elias drinks burnt coffee beneath old seed company calendars. Several locals warn him he's making a mistake fighting the project. Some families already spent their buyout money. Others fear eminent domain proceedings may follow. Elias says little. At home that night, he unlocks an old metal filing cabinet in his garage workshop. Inside are county plats, handwritten route surveys, engineering drafts, and faded correspondence from 1981 involving something called the Blackwater Drainage Revision. The narration slowly reveals Elias once assisted county surveyor Walter Boone during emergency flood control mapping decades earlier. Elias spreads documents across a wooden workbench beneath a hanging bulb. He studies one specific discrepancy repeatedly: Parcel 7 access corridor. A folded survey overlay does not match the modern corporate land maps. He circles a handwritten notation. Conditional agricultural transit easement only. The narration never fully explains why this matters yet. Instead, suspense builds through fragments. Elias visits the county library archives the next morning. Dusty newspaper reels reveal that the original industrial rail proposal from 1982 collapsed after a state funding dispute. The corridor rights were never fully converted afterward. A librarian mentions many county records were transferred during courthouse renovations in the 90s. Some boxes disappeared, she says quietly. That line lingers. Later, Halbrecht executives hold an internal meeting. Kessler mocks Elias to junior staff, describing him as another sentimental landowner clinging to obsolete paperwork. But the company's lead legal consultant, Meredith Vale, asks one important question. Did anyone verify the pre-consolidation transit filings? Silence. A junior associate admits most records came through title abstraction summaries prepared during acquisition acceleration. Vale becomes uneasy. Meanwhile, Elias returns home during snowfall. He sits alone at the kitchen table with tea steaming beside him. He removes the yellow receipt again. This time the audience finally sees part of it. Mercer County Emergency Survey Storage, Box 14C. Paid, $12,000. Date, August 3, 1981. The chapter ends with Elias opening a hidden storage compartment beneath his workshop floorboards. Inside are sealed survey tubes tied with faded red county tags. And one legal folder labeled in Boone's handwriting. Not for transfer until route status is legally verified. The final line. For the first time in 30 years, Elias Turner smiled. Snow covered Mercer County in thin, uneven streaks by the following Monday, the kind that turned gravel roads gray instead of white. Elias Turner drove into town before sunrise with the same thermos of bitter coffee balanced beside him and Walter Boone's legal folder resting on the passenger seat beneath a wool blanket. The courthouse square was nearly empty except for a county plow and a delivery truck unloading paper supplies near the clerk's entrance. Elias parked beside the old Veterans Memorial and sat motionless for almost a full minute before stepping out into the cold. He knew exactly where he was going. The lower archive room beneath the Mercer County Courthouse had once been part of the old records annex before the renovation in 1994. Most people in town forgot it existed. Flooding problems had damaged portions of the basement decades earlier, and after the remodel, nearly all official records were moved upstairs into climate-controlled storage. Nearly all. Elias walked through a narrow maintenance corridor beside the boiler room and stopped at a steel door with faded stenciled lettering. Survey storage, authorized access only. The same wording printed on the yellow receipt. He unlocked it with a small brass key from his coat pocket. The room smelled like wet paper and dust sealed for too many winters. Filing cabinets lined the walls beneath exposed pipes. Some drawers hung crooked. Others had rust welded around the handles. A single chain light buzzed overhead. Elias moved carefully through the cabinets until he reached one labeled Drainage and Access Modifications, 1978 to 1983. He opened the bottom drawer. Empty folders. Missing index cards. Large gaps where records should have been. But not everything was gone. One cabinet in the back corner still held transfer logs from the Boone survey years. Elias sat at a folding table and quietly began matching parcel references from Boone's notebook against transit corridor revisions. Approved after the Blackwater flooding crisis of 1980. The narration slows deliberately here. Specific parcel numbers. County seal stamps. Handwritten initials. Coffee stains on engineering drafts. A procedural mystery begins forming piece by piece. The original Blackwater agricultural transit easement had never been upgraded into permanent industrial freight access. State transportation lawyers postponed the conversion after environmental objections halted the rail expansion project in 1982. Then the project died. But the temporary corridor language remained buried inside the county route framework. Meaning every future transfer depended on agricultural continuity status. Not commercial logistics development. Elias studies the wording again beneath the dim light. Transit authorization valid exclusively under active agricultural designation. A tiny sentence. Easy to overlook. $48 million suddenly balanced on 14 words. Outside, the courthouse clock struck 9. Upstairs, County Clerk Denise Holloway nearly dropped her coffee when she saw Elias emerge from the archive stairwell carrying survey tubes. You still had access down there. Boone gave me the key before he passed. She frowned slightly. That room was supposed to be cleared years ago. It wasn't. Denise watched him carefully. She had known Elias most of her life. Knew he rarely spoke unless he was certain. What exactly are you looking for? Elias adjusted the tubes beneath his arm. Something they forgot to finish. The line stayed with her after he left. Across town, Halbrecht Development held a financing conference call with state investors and regional banking partners. Executives celebrated nearing final parcel consolidation. Construction schedules were already circulating. Preliminary equipment staging had begun near the interstate corridor. Nathan Kessler spoke confidently about minimal local resistance. Then Meredith Vale interrupted the meeting. I want a complete review of all pre-1985 easement transfers connected to Parcel 7. The room quieted. One executive asked why. Vale answered carefully. Because the farmer who offered us $12,000 wasn't negotiating. He was referencing something. Kessler dismissed the concern immediately. He's bluffing with obsolete county paperwork. Maybe, Vale replied. But old paperwork is where land problems come from. That sentence shifted the atmosphere. Later that afternoon, a young legal associate named Evan Pike drove to Mercer County Records to pull archived abstracts. He expected a routine verification process. Instead, he found inconsistencies everywhere. Transfer summaries referenced amended corridor filings that no longer appeared in the primary record chain. Several easement descriptions used vague shorthand instead of legal conversion language. One abstract included handwritten notation. Subject to Boone revision pending route clarification. Pending. Not finalized. Evan called Meredith Vale from the records office. I think there's a continuity issue. How bad? I don't know yet. Then don't speculate, she said quietly. Just keep digging. That evening Elias sat inside his garage workshop while sleet tapped softly against the windows. Old maps covered the workbench beneath weighted wrenches and coffee mugs. He carefully aligned survey overlays across decades of county revisions. The audience begins noticing his process. Everything measured. Everything patient. No dramatic speeches. No emotional outbursts. Just preparation. His granddaughter Claire arrived after finishing her shift at the veterinary clinic outside town. She brought groceries and noticed the maps immediately. You finally going after them? Elias kept studying the overlay. They came after themselves. Claire watched him in silence before asking the question lingering since the beginning. What's really in those files? Elias leaned back slowly. In 1981, the county rushed flood access approvals after the Blackwater overflow destroyed 2 bridges. Boone discovered the state used Emergency Agricultural Authority to bypass commercial hearings. Claire frowned. So the corridor was temporary? Supposed to be. What happened? No one cleaned the paperwork after the rail project collapsed. The realization landed heavily. Claire pulled out a chair. And Halbrecht never checked. Elias finally looked at her. They checked the summaries. He slid a faded survey map across the table. But not the foundation underneath them. The narration shifts toward quiet tension as Claire begins helping organize documents into labeled legal folders. Parcel maps. Easement chains. County transfer codes. Boone's handwritten annotations. Family loyalty becomes central here. Not revenge through anger. Revenge through patience inherited across generations. Meanwhile, at Halbrecht headquarters in Des Moines, Meredith Vale remains alone in the conference room long after staff leave for the night. Rain streaks across the glass windows while she studies scanned copies from Mercer County. Then she notices something alarming. The company's primary freight entrance sits directly atop the disputed corridor language. Without permanent commercial conversion rights, the state transportation permit could become challengeable. Not invalid. Challengeable. Enough to freeze financing. Enough to trigger investor withdrawal clauses. Enough to stop construction deadlines. Meredith slowly removes her glasses. For the first time, someone inside Halbrecht understands the scale of the danger. Back in Mercer County, Elias locks Boone's folder inside a metal case beside the workshop wall. The kettle whistles softly in the kitchen. Snow drifts against the porch steps. Claire watches her grandfather write one final line into his notebook before closing it. "Do they know yet?" she asks. Elias stares toward the dark workshop window. Not the important part. The chapter ends the next morning when a black corporate SUV quietly parks across from Elias Turner's farmhouse before sunrise. The black SUV remained across from Elias Turner's farmhouse for nearly 3 hours. It sat beside the frozen drainage ditch with the engine running softly in the pre-dawn dark while snow drifted across the fields in slow ribbons. Elias noticed it immediately from the kitchen window but never reacted. He continued pouring hot water into his chipped ceramic mug while the tea kettle hissed faintly behind him. Claire noticed it too. "You know them?" "No. You gonna ask what they want?" Elias folded Boone's notebook shut. "They'll come when they're ready." The narration lingers on the stillness of the farmhouse. Old clocks ticking. Pipes knocking softly from the cold. The hum of the refrigerator. Rural silence carrying tension more effectively than shouting ever could. At exactly 7:12 a.m., the SUV finally pulled into the driveway. A man in his 30s stepped out wearing polished boots unsuitable for Iowa winter gravel. He introduced himself as Daniel Croft, external counsel representing Halbrecht Development. Not litigation counsel. Resolution counsel. Even the wording felt procedural. Elias invited him inside without warmth or hostility. Croft sat stiffly at the kitchen table while Claire quietly made coffee. He attempted polite conversation about weather conditions and county road closures before eventually producing a slim leather folder. "We'd like to reopen discussions regarding your property position." Elias stirred sugar into his tea. "My property wasn't for sale." Croft adjusted carefully. "Your procedural concerns, then." Claire watched the attorney closely. "What concerns?" Croft ignored the question. He slid a typed document across the table, a private settlement offer including land acquisition premiums, relocation assistance, legal compensation coverage, and non-disclosure provisions. Total figure: $640,000. Nearly triple the original offer. Claire looked stunned. Elias barely glanced at it. "That was quick." Croft forced a small smile. "The company prefers cooperation." Elias finally looked up. "No. The company prefers certainty." Silence settled over the kitchen. Croft's tone changed slightly. "Mr. Turner, these archival discrepancies may create temporary administrative delays, but they won't stop development permanently." Elias nodded once. "That's true." Croft seemed relieved. Then Elias continued. "But financing delays can." The attorney's expression tightened almost invisibly. Elias stood and walked into the workshop. After several seconds he returned carrying one narrow survey tube tied with faded red string. He placed it gently on the table. Croft stared at it. Elias did not open it. "You tell Ms. Vale something for me," he said quietly. "The corridor isn't the problem." Croft hesitated. "Then what is?" Elias slid the tube toward him slightly. "The route attached to it." Croft left 10 minutes later with the settlement papers untouched. The suspense sharpens because the audience still does not fully understand the route issue either. Only that the danger is growing. Later that afternoon, Meredith Vale reviewed Croft's meeting notes inside Halbrecht's Des Moines legal office. Rain hammered against the windows while acquisition staff argued quietly in nearby conference rooms. "What did he show you?" she asked. "Nothing. He wanted us to know he has something." Croft handed her a photograph he secretly took of the survey tube label. Vale studied the faded writing. "Blackwater route revision, State Auxiliary Access Study. Her face changed immediately. She stood without another word and walked directly into the records department. The narration transitions into procedural investigation. Corporate researchers begin reconstructing transportation filings from the early 80s. Legal assistants pull microfilm archives from state databases. Engineers compare modern freight maps against flood control overlays. And slowly a buried problem surfaces. The original emergency agricultural corridor had been routed across protected drainage stabilization land tied to conditional federal maintenance agreements after the 1980 flood disaster. Commercial freight conversion required environmental recertification, which apparently never happened. Meaning Halbrecht's entire logistics entrance may have been approved using inherited assumptions rather than fully verified route authority. The distinction is subtle. Technically complicated. Catastrophically expensive. A junior analyst quietly asks. How did nobody catch this? No one answers. Meanwhile, Elias drives to Boone County, nearly 2 hours away, to visit retired highway engineer Leonard Voss at a nursing home overlooking frozen cornfields. The scene slows emotionally. Voss is old now. Frail hands. Oxygen tubes. Television flickering silently in the background. But when Elias places Boone's notebook on the blanket, the old engineer immediately recognizes it. Walter kept everything, Voss says softly. He hid the important parts. Voss laughs weakly. That sounds like him. Through restrained dialogue, the audience learns more history. After the 1980 flood crisis, state officials rushed emergency transport routes through agricultural exemptions to avoid federal review delays. Temporary permissions were granted while permanent studies were supposedly scheduled later. Then budget cuts came. Administrations changed. Projects collapsed. Paperwork disappeared into filing cabinets. But Boone discovered something before his death. Certain parcels tied to Blackwater Corridor still carried conditional federal maintenance oversight buried inside old drainage agreements. Elias asks the critical question quietly. If commercial freight crosses protected drainage stabilization land without recertification? Voss looks toward the snowy window. Federal injunction risk. The room falls silent. Not a guaranteed victory. But enough danger to freeze investors instantly. Elias says nothing for several seconds. Then. Did Boone ever finish the route verification? Voss slowly shakes his head. He said someone would try to bury it if he did. Back in Mercer County, rumors begin spreading through diners, grain elevators, and feed stores that Halbrecht's project may be delayed. Local landowners who already signed contracts become nervous. Some blame Elias. Others quietly admire him. At the diner, one farmer asks him directly. You really think you can stop them? Elias unfolds a napkin carefully beside his coffee. No. The farmer looks confused. Then what are you doing? Elias stares at the steam rising from the mug. Making them tell the truth before they build. The emotional restraint strengthens his character more than speeches ever could. That evening Claire helps Elias organize copied records into chronological binders. She notices him setting aside one specific document repeatedly. A folded federal maintenance map stamped 1983. What's special about this one? Elias studies it carefully. This is where they got careless. Before he can explain further, headlights sweep across the workshop windows. Another vehicle approaches. Not corporate this time. County Clerk Denise Holloway steps out carrying a sealed envelope. I wasn't sure I should bring this, she says. Inside is a notice from the Iowa Infrastructure Finance Authority. Halbrecht's Funding Review Board has scheduled an emergency compliance hearing in 10 days. Claire looks stunned. They're already panicking. Denise nods grimly. And there's something else. She removes a second document. A confidential request for expedited eminent domain preparation. Filed that afternoon by Halbrecht Development. Claire's anger flashes immediately. They're trying to force him out. But Elias remains calm. Too calm. He studies the filing for several quiet seconds before reaching for Boone's notebook again. Then he opens to a page the audience has never seen before. Handwritten beside Parcel 7 is a sentence underlined twice in red ink. Secondary survey copy stored separately if route challenge becomes necessary. Claire looks at him slowly. You already knew there was another copy. Elias closes the notebook. I knew Boone wouldn't trust just one drawer. The chapter ends with Elias walking alone into his dark garage storage room carrying a flashlight. He kneels beside the floorboards and begins removing another hidden panel beneath the concrete workbench. The concrete panel beneath the workshop came loose with difficulty. Years of dust and hardened moisture had sealed the edges into place, and Elias had to pry carefully with the flat end of an old fencing hammer while Claire held the flashlight steady beside him. The garage remained silent except for the scrape of metal against concrete and the distant whistle of winter wind outside the barn. Finally the panel shifted. Beneath it sat a narrow steel lockbox wrapped in oilcloth. Claire stared. You hid this down here the whole time? Elias brushed dirt from the lid. No, he said quietly. Walter did. The emotional weight of the moment comes not through dramatic music or speeches, but through restraint. The audience understands that Boone had anticipated this decades earlier. He knew someone might eventually need these records. Elias carried the box to the workbench beneath the hanging light. Inside were survey negatives, handwritten engineering annotations, county correspondence copies, and one sealed brown envelope marked Route Liability Review, Private Draft. Claire carefully unfolded the first document while Elias examined the survey negatives against modern parcel overlays. The discrepancy became unmistakable. The official county summaries used by Halbrecht referenced a revised freight alignment that technically crossed land never cleared for permanent industrial stabilization. But Boone's private route review contained something worse. A memorandum from 1983. Unsigned. Never filed publicly. The narration slows deliberately as Elias reads portions silently beneath the yellow workshop light. The memo warned that converting Blackwater agricultural transit corridors into permanent commercial freight access without updated drainage certification could expose the county and future developers to federal environmental injunctions and infrastructure liability disputes. Not theoretical concerns. Known risks. Known by someone. Claire looked up slowly. They knew. Elias nodded once. Somebody did. The deeper implication settles heavily. This was no longer just overlooked paperwork. Someone decades earlier had intentionally allowed incomplete route authority to remain unresolved because fixing it would have triggered expensive regulatory review. And over time, the assumptions hardened into accepted fact. The trap was never created by Elias. It was inherited. Across the state in Des Moines, Halbrecht's executive offices no longer resembled a confident development operation. Conference room doors remained closed. Legal assistants carried boxes between departments. Outside counsel arrived before sunrise. The company's lenders had begun asking questions. Meredith Vale stood at the end of a long glass table reviewing updated risk summaries while Nathan Kessler paced angrily nearby. This entire project cannot hinge on one retired farmer and a basement filing cabinet. Vale didn't look up. It hinges on whether the Transportation Authority used valid route certification. We have approved permits. You have approved permits based on inherited filings. Kessler stopped pacing. Same thing. No, Vale replied calmly. Not if the filings were incomplete. A silence followed that felt heavier than shouting. One of the junior attorneys entered carrying a newly obtained federal maintenance overlay map. We found the stabilization boundary. Vale studied it for less than 10 seconds before understanding the problem completely. The primary freight interchange crossed directly through protected drainage reinforcement territory tied to post-flood federal recovery agreements from 1981. Commercial conversion should have triggered environmental recertification decades earlier. Which meant one challenge motion could potentially freeze the entire financing package pending review. Not permanently destroy the project. But delay it long enough to collapse investor confidence. $48 million suddenly depended on time. And Elias Turner seemed to understand that better than anyone. Back in Mercer County, Claire drove into town to scan Boone's documents at the Public Library archives while Elias visited retired attorney Samuel Grady, who once handled agricultural land disputes during the 80s. Grady lived alone above an old hardware store near the rail line. The office smelled like dust, tobacco, and paper aging inside wooden cabinets. He listened quietly while Elias spread the route maps across the desk. After nearly 15 minutes of silence, Grady leaned back slowly. "You understand what this actually is?" Elias folded his hands. "A financing vulnerability." Grady gave a faint smile. "No. Financing is just where the bleeding starts." He pointed toward the federal overlay. "If this route challenge becomes public before infrastructure bonds finalize, every lender attached to the project has disclosure exposure." Elias remained expressionless. "Enough for injunction leverage?" "Potentially." The old attorney removed his glasses carefully. "But once you move forward, this stops being county politics. What does it become?" Grady looked directly at him. "A very expensive argument." The line lands with quiet force. That evening Claire returns with digitized copies of Boone's records stored on multiple flash drives and printed binders. The farmhouse table disappears beneath stacks of documents, route diagrams, drainage studies, handwritten notes, and legal references from the late 70s. The recurring motifs intensify. Coffee growing cold. Paper edges worn soft by time. Maps taped together. Pencils marking timelines. Silence replacing emotion. Claire finally asks the question building since the beginning. Why didn't Boone expose this himself? Elias studies the old memorandum again. Because he worked for the county. That didn't stop him from hiding the records. No, Elias says softly. It stopped him from trusting anyone with them. The narration briefly flashes backward through memory fragments. Walter Boone smoking beside survey trucks. Flooded roads in 1980. County officials rushing emergency approvals. Boxes moved during courthouse renovations. Quiet warnings nobody documented officially. Then the story returns to the present. A knock sounds at the farmhouse door after dark. Not Halbrecht this time. Two representatives from the Iowa Infrastructure Finance Authority stand outside holding identification folders. Professional. Polite. Nervous. One introduces herself as Deputy Compliance Director Renee Talbot. "We'd like to ask a few questions regarding your documentation." Elias invites them inside. The meeting remains tense but restrained. Talbot carefully avoids confirming the scale of the state's concern, yet her questions reveal everything indirectly. Did Elias possess original survey copies? Did he have proof of continuity gaps? Had the documents been shared externally? Most importantly, was he planning formal legal action? Elias answers with precise restraint. "I haven't decided." Talbot exchanges a quick glance with her associate. That reaction alone tells the audience the pressure has reached state level. Before leaving, Talbot pauses beside the workshop doorway. "If this proceeds publicly," she says quietly, "there will be pressure to settle." Elias nods. "There already is." After they leave, Claire exhales slowly. They're scared. Elias watches the taillights disappear down the snowy road. "No," he says. "They're late." The emotional beat lands heavily because he says it without satisfaction. Only certainty. The following morning, Halbrecht Development submits a revised private settlement offer through legal counsel. $3 million. Full land retention rights. Lifetime royalty participation. Confidential resolution agreement. Claire reads the number twice. "They're offering you millions now." Elias doesn't react. Instead, he unfolds Boone's private memorandum one final time. At the bottom corner sits a handwritten note previously hidden beneath another page. 3 words. If challenged publicly. Below it. Secondary correspondence retained with federal liaison. Claire's face tightens. There's more. Elias looks toward the dark fields outside the window. Yes. Where? For the first time since the story began, Elias hesitates. Then he reaches for his coat. Chicago. The train station locker beneath Union Terminal in Chicago had not been opened in 37 years. Elias Turner stood alone in the lower corridor shortly after dawn while commuters hurried past with coffee cups and briefcases, never noticing the old farmer in the brown wool coat holding a brass key with worn edges. Claire stood beside him carrying Boone's leather notebook inside a canvas bag. Locker 214. The metal door resisted at first. Then the lock finally turned. Inside sat a narrow document tube, a sealed bank envelope, and 2 cassette tapes wrapped carefully in wax paper. Nothing else. No dramatic treasure. No hidden fortune. Just records. The kind capable of stopping corporations. Elias removed the envelope first. Across the front, written in Walter Boone's careful handwriting, were 6 words. Only if they force the route. Claire looked at him slowly. He planned all this? Elias shook his head. No. He planned for someone to ignore him. That distinction mattered. Back in Iowa, Halbrecht Development's emergency compliance hearing had already begun inside a state infrastructure conference room in Des Moines. Attorneys filled the tables. Financial consultants whispered beside stacks of binders. Representatives from lending groups attended remotely through secured video calls. Nathan Kessler looked exhausted now. Not arrogant. Not confident. Just tired. Because overnight, rumors about the Blackwater Corridor review had spread beyond Mercer County into regional investment circles. Reporters were beginning to ask questions about environmental certification continuity. The project had not collapsed yet. But money was becoming nervous. And nervous money moved fast. Meredith Vale entered carrying updated risk memorandums prepared before sunrise. Her expression alone unsettled the room. One lender representative asked the question directly. Can the route challenge stop construction? Vale answered honestly. Yes. The room went silent. Not permanently. Not necessarily. But long enough to trigger cascading financing reviews, insurance reevaluations, and federal oversight inquiries. Which, in large-scale development, often amounted to the same thing. Meanwhile, inside a quiet Chicago hotel room, Elias and Claire finally opened Boone's final records. The first discovery was procedural. The second was devastating. Boone had retained correspondence copies between county officials and a federal drainage liaison from 1983. In those letters, concerns about permanent freight conversion risks were discussed explicitly after stabilization surveys revealed long-term erosion concerns beneath portions of Blackwater Corridor. One county official recommended postponing commercial certification until additional environmental review occurred. But another memo suggested delaying action quietly, to avoid jeopardizing active agricultural access agreements. Meaning someone knowingly allowed temporary language to remain unresolved because correcting it publicly would have stalled regional development plans decades earlier. Claire sat speechless beside the hotel window. They buried it. Elias continued reading silently. Then he reached the cassette tapes. Using an old recorder borrowed from the hotel concierge, they listened carefully. Walter Boone's voice filled the room, older, tired, deliberate. The recording was not dramatic. It sounded like a man documenting facts because he no longer trusted institutions to preserve them honestly. Boone described meetings after the 1980 flood disaster. Pressure from state transportation offices. Emergency approvals rushed through agricultural exemptions. Warnings ignored. And one critical statement. If commercial freight ever uses this route without recertification, liability won't belong to the county alone. It'll follow every developer who inherits the corridor knowingly. Claire covered her mouth slowly. Because now the danger had changed entirely. This was no longer about a technical delay. If Halbrecht proceeded after becoming aware of unresolved certification exposure, future liability arguments could become far more serious. Elias stopped the tape. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally Claire asked quietly, "What are you going to do?" Elias looked toward the gray Chicago skyline. The audience expects revenge here. Destruction. Public humiliation. But the story stays emotionally disciplined. I'm going to give them one chance to stop lying. That afternoon Elias returned to Des Moines. Not with television cameras. Not with reporters. Just a legal folder and Boone's recordings. The emergency hearing had recessed temporarily when Meredith Vale received notice that Elias Turner had arrived downstairs requesting private discussion. Kessler immediately objected. Vale ignored him. The meeting took place in a small conference room overlooking the frozen river downtown. No theatrics. No shouting. Only documents spread quietly across polished wood. Elias placed Boone's correspondence copies in front of them first. Then the federal liaison letters. Then transcripts from the recordings. As Meredith Vale read, the color slowly drained from her face. Kessler attempted resistance immediately. These are unofficial drafts. Old opinions. Nothing binding. Elias nodded calmly. That's true. Then he slid the final document across the table. A certified continuity memorandum signed during the 1984 County Transition Review. Forgotten. Never indexed properly. But legally valid. The memorandum acknowledged unresolved commercial certification status and recommended future route recertification before any industrial freight conversion. Meredith closed her eyes briefly. Because now the issue was undeniable. Halbrecht had inherited incomplete authority. And once formally notified, continuing construction exposure became extraordinarily dangerous. Kessler stared at Elias across the table. What do you want? The line hangs heavily because everyone expects money. Power. Punishment. Elias answered without emotion. You withdraw the forced acquisition filings. Silence. You correct the route publicly. Another silence. And the county families who already sold get restoration options before your investors do. Vale looked at him carefully. You'd walk away from millions for that? Elias folded Boone's notebook closed. This was never about millions. For the first time in the story, Nathan Kessler truly understood the mistake they made. They thought Elias Turner was protecting land. But he had been protecting leverage. And patience. The negotiations lasted 14 hours. By midnight, Halbrecht Development agreed to suspend the Blackwater Logistics Corridor pending independent certification review. Eminent domain preparation filings were withdrawn. Emergency settlement frameworks were created for affected landowners. Officially, the company described the decision as voluntary infrastructure reassessment. Unofficially, investors fled within weeks. The $48 million land deal froze indefinitely. Spring arrived slowly across Mercer County. Snow melted into dark soil along the drainage roads. Tractors returned to the fields. County gossip faded into quieter stories. Halbrecht's temporary acquisition office closed before summer. The glass walls were stripped bare. No grand public victory came for Elias Turner. No headlines called him a hero. Most people never learned the full story. That felt realistic. Months later, Claire visited the farmhouse one evening after work and found Elias sitting alone on the porch with coffee cooling beside him. The field stretched gold beneath the setting sun. Peaceful. Ordinary. She handed him a newspaper clipping from Des Moines mentioning ongoing state reviews tied to historical infrastructure certification failures. Tiny article. Buried near the back. Claire smiled faintly. You could have destroyed them. Elias watched wind move across the soybeans. They did that part themselves. She sat beside him quietly. After a long silence, she asked the question lingering since the beginning. Why did you really offer them $12,000? Elias reached into his coat pocket and removed the faded yellow receipt from 1981. Mercer County Emergency Survey Storage. Paid $12,000. He studied it one final time before answering. Because that's what Walter spent trying to preserve the truth. The kettle whistled softly inside the farmhouse. The sun lowered behind the fields. And for the first time in 40 years, the Blackwater corridor stopped moving forward.